Thank you again, Tom, for joining us to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the Nakba. And I know that academics refrain from being effusive in their praise of other books, but I thoroughly enjoyed your book. It is such a stunning and powerful record of the actions of the Zionist movement in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s as they planned and executed the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in 1948. And I want to remind everyone that you can, if you make a donation of over $40 to PCAP, we will send you a copy of Tom's book, which is such a powerful account of this historical period. So briefly, I'm wondering if you can share with us what attracted you to the cause of Palestine, what continues to motivate you to remain committed in this advocacy, even after public attempts to slander your credibility for this advocacy.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you for making this possible and for being here. Well, I don't know. I came of age during the U.S. war against Vietnam, and like so many others of all ages, I spent much of my time actively opposing that crime. And so I grew up learning never to accept blindly anything the government tells us, and to question the versions of events as presented by the major news media. And I was lucky in that, unlike some of my peers, my parents not only strongly reinforced this critical mindset, but in fact nurtured it. And I'm very happy to say that my daughter carries on the same good fight. In the years following the US withdrawal from Vietnam, Palestine started to emerge as another colonial war of aggression for which my country, the United States, was principally responsible. Now, there had, of course, been other major US crimes during those years, such as the misery and death we inflicted on the people of Chile. But coups were events whose terror then continued on its own. Israel's crimes against the Palestinians, in contrast, continued with the active, ongoing support of the United States. And the case of Palestine is so blatant and sustained that it also emerged as a sort of symbolic line in the sand between our society's pretensions of principle versus its staggering hypocrisy. 15 years ago, my partner Nancy and I, we went to the West Bank to see for ourselves. And as with anyone who has been there, once you see it, you can't unknow it. The stark difference between what's right in front of your eyes versus the narrative with which we, the public, are kept sedated, keeps hold of you. Now, as regards my plowing ahead despite the endless slander, no, my being vocal did not really start until there was not much the propagandists could do to me beyond the smears. Yes, I was still working, but it was not like many years earlier where, when as a freelance violinist in New York, such smears could have put me out of business. In contrast, I should say my partner, Nancy, also a violinist, she still has a full-time position in one of the major London orchestras, the London Philharmonic. And to give you an example of what people like she is up against, in 2011, she, along with 3 other members of the orchestra, were suspended for 7 months without pay, publicly libeled, placed under a gag order, and very nearly fired simply for signing a letter protesting the BBC's invitation of the Israel Philharmonic to perform at the Proms Music Festival. But for me, no, it's not an issue.
Thank you, Tom. And I would alert the audience that on your website, TomSuarez.com, there's a list of your articles, and one of them is your account and perseverance and determination to teach violin to students in Palestine, and what you have gone through to remain committed to that goal. It just speaks of your commitment to justice. So thank you so much. Your argument in the book, Palestine Hijacked, is that the Zionist movement was not just motivated to establish, as you say, Jewish safety and dignity, but to create an ethnically predicated settler state for which persecuted Jews were its renewable fuel. Before we go into some specifics, can you speak generally about this larger argument of how you see the Zionist movement as using terrorism in Palestine to create a Jewish settler state, and how it needed to maintain the impression that the persecution of Jews demanded an ethnically Jewish majority state in Palestine, free of Palestinian Arabs?
Well, you say that the Zionist movement was not just motivated to establish the Jewish safety and dignity, etc. I would, in fact, state it more strongly. The Zionist movement was not motivated by these goals, indeed worked against them. What is Zionism? Zionism is, when you come down to it, it's a cult with all the negative connotations of that word. As such, it needed to place itself above Judaism. It had to body snatch Jewish identity, demand worldwide Jewish allegiance to it, and make permanent its alleged reason to exist. And what was that reason? Well, anti-Jewish persecution. And with it, Zionism had to make eternal the libel of Jews as forever separate from the rest of humanity. Without this, Zionism would cease to exist. Imagine a disease, in this case, anti-Semitism, for which the alleged sole cure required the maintenance of the disease so that you'd forever need the alleged cure. Obviously, any true cure would have to be condemned, while the disease itself, in non-lethal doses, would have to be nurtured. This is Zionism. We see it over and over again where true anti-racists lose their academic positions on the smear of anti-Semitism, or to cite two prominent anti-racist US politicians, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, constantly smeared, while true bigots like Donald Trump become Israeli heroes. Or here in the United Kingdom, where the most anti-racist, non-anti-Semitic leader the country might ever have had, Jeremy Corbyn, was sabotaged on the lie of anti-Semitism. The Zionist movement is addicted to anti-Semitism. During the Second World War, the Jewish agency, what would become the Israeli government, declared as its foremost enemy non-Zionist Jews. And its second foremost enemy was, quote, the democracies and their Atlantic Charter, the Atlantic Charter, of course, being in effect a precursor to the United Nations. Ben-Gurion himself indeed lamented that the democracies, this is his quote, the democracies, in contrast to the dictator states, recognize the Jews as people having full rights of citizenship. And he blamed this and America's, quote, democratic attitude for Zionism's problems. Zionism requires anti-Jewish persecution, or at least the perception of it, as a permanent state of the human condition, and the acknowledgement of this dates all the way back to Herzl. And like all cults, Zionism has created a psychosis among its followers, who are kept in line both through peer pressure, the fear of being ostracized, and by turning reality upside down as regards their enemy. Anti-racists are to be feared, whereas bigots and even neo-fascists are Zionism's friends. But in stark contrast to garden variety cults, in which society at large offers a refuge, an escape, Zionism is supported at the highest levels of the Western world. Indeed, countries like the United States, Britain, France, and Germany penalize anyone challenging this cult and even make it illegal to do so. Ben-Gurion, Israel's equivalent of our George Washington, stated outright that Israel has nothing to do with Judaism, but rather with his words, quote, being a Jew, and nor with being just an Israeli Jew, but the ethnicity itself. So imagine this. Imagine a self-proclaimed Christian leader who establishes that Christianity is not a religion, but a race, that his group is the sole representative of that quote unquote race, and that all Christians are bound to a particular nation state by virtue of that race beyond the individual's consent. Now, this is so blatantly offensive and preposterous as to sound like a lunatic even to say it, but this is Zionism against Jews. Now, I'll go slightly off topic, but I think it's relevant because everything we talk about should ultimately be toward ending this horror in Palestine. The premise that a state is part of the DNA of an ethnic identity is unknown in the modern world, with two exceptions: Israel and common bigots. Racists blame individuals by virtue of claimed oneness with some ethnicity or nationality or type. And so during the spread of COVID-19, Chinese-looking people were attacked because the virus came from China. They, the Chinese, caused COVID. Now, this is classic ignorant bigotry, and we all condemn it. Israel's anti-Semitism works by doing precisely this to Jews, but turning it around, upside down, in order to hold Jewish identity hostage to insulate its crimes. And instead of condemning it, we run in fear from it. In other words, we would say Israel did XYZ. What would a bigot say? A bigot would say the Jews did XYZ. But that bigot is the Israeli state and its cheerleaders, who have made state and ethnicity synonymous in order to repackage criticism of the state as anti-Semitic. Other states deflect criticism of their crimes by hiding behind the flag, accusing dissenting citizens of being unpatriotic to the state. Israel instead hides behind the ethnicity, free of borders, accusing dissenting voices anywhere of being traitorous to the ethnicity. Traditional anti-Semitism, for all its horrors, is powerless to harm the integrity of Jews or Judaism, powerless to make its libels true. The Israeli state and Zionism, if we accept them at their word, succeed. If we accept their claims on Jewish identity, then we are the common racists blaming Jews as Jews. Now, I've diverged from the topic because everything we discuss, everything we do, should not be in a vacuum merely for academics' sake, but everything must always be a tool toward the ending of the ongoing horror in Palestine, in Israel, and especially in the camps. Exposing Zionism for what it is key to freedom for the Palestinians.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for that description. And regarding all your evidence to make this argument, especially about the propaganda, where contemporaries of the Zionists are comparing them to fascists, it is so thoroughly researched, especially from the National Archives in the UK, as well as the Israeli archive. So it's a very thoroughly researched book. I want to pick up on what you talked about regarding Jewish criticism of Zionism, and then not all Jews accepted these arguments. You discuss how Zionism had to erase and excise the shared inheritance of the land between Jews, Arab Muslims, and Arab Christians, conceiving it as always having been just a Jewish entity, and that the Jews were the true sovereigns of the land and the Palestinians were usurpers. This poses, though, an early problem for the Zionists. One is the fellow Jews who don't believe in this, and the other is that Zionism is making an implicit ideological alliance with anti-Semites, because they believe in the premise Jewish people should not live in Europe. There are some really fascinating examples of some figures, Jewish figures in the early period of the 1920s, late 19th century, pre-World War I, early World War I, who are Jewish opponents to Zionism, and that the Zionists even use anti-Semitic language to smear these opponents. Dr. Yaakov Israel Dahan, and various others. Is there one that stands out for you that you want to share with us?
I see it as the larger picture, whereby anybody who challenged the narrative was in trouble, because for its settler project, Zionism had to make Jewish identity a matter of biology, not choice, and it had to establish Zionism and the Israeli state, the state itself, as an intrinsic part of its DNA, and to make the state one and the same with the biblical realm of the same name. The Zionist project was, in every sense of the word, a marketing venture. Israel was the brand name it needed to sell its messianic theater, and Palestine was and remains the only possible stage for that theater. In its beginnings, Zionism was seen for what it is, a betrayal of the struggle for equality and a gift to bigots. Now, to be sure, Jews who were being persecuted in Europe and Russia, who were told that Zionism offered them a chance to be free of their tormentors and start a new life in freedom, are blameless in this. But from the beginning, Zionism did not see Palestine as a land for Jewish immigration per se, but for the ethnic cleansing of non-Jews to create a race state. Herzl himself, were he alive today, would correctly be dismissed as anti-Semitic, referring to non-Zionist religious Jews as his quote, a hideous distortion of the human character, something unspeakably low and repulsive. These are the words of the founder of political Zionism. In its early decades, few Jews wanted anything to do with Zionism. Most wanted equality in their home countries, not a new ghetto far from home. After the first Zionist Congress in 1897, the Berlin correspondent for the London Standard put it this way. He reported that, quote, the idea of founding a modern Jewish state, which goes by the name of Zionism, finds little favor in Germany except among the anti-Semites. As one of his sources put it, quote, in short, the degeneration which calls itself anti-Semitism has begotten the degeneration which adorns itself with the name of Zionism. In 1917, Edwin Montagu, a Jewish member of parliament, viewed, quote, with horror, the idea of Jewish nationalism, that Jews constitute a race worldwide, and bluntly accused the British government of anti-Semitism for cavorting with the Zionists. In 1919, California Congressman Julius Kahn argued that, quote, for the very reason that the new era upon which the world is entering aims to establish government everywhere on principles of true democracy, we reject the Zionist project. He wrote in disgust at Zionism's reduction of Jews into a nationality and warned that, quote, no Jew, wherever he may live, can consider himself free from the implications of such a grant. In 1924, the first major act by the newly formed Haganah, the militia of the Jewish Agency, which was billed as a strictly defensive militia and what would become the Israeli Defense Forces, its first major act was to assassinate Dr. Yaakov Israel Dahan, as you've mentioned, for the crime of vocally opposing Zionism. Indeed, during the years of the British Mandate leading to the establishment of the Israeli state, most victims of Zionist assassinations, that is, the targeted killing of specific individuals, were Jews. Now, I think it's essential at this point to acknowledge that those of us fighting for justice in Palestine more often than not allow the Zionists to control the terms of debate, meaning that we tend to respond in context of their narrative. And a core way in which they have succeeded is in couching the so-called conflict, that word itself a major coup of propaganda, as Israel and the Palestinians. No, framing it like this is wrong. Jews were always part of the fabric of Arab Palestinian civilization until the arrival of the Zionists. All Palestinians, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Druze, whatever, uniformly opposed Zionism. But eventually, the Zionists extracted all Jews from Palestinian civilization, robbing them of their Arab Palestinian identity. The notion of Jews versus Arabs is a political invention. That the rest were not Jewish and nothing else is why Israel has condemned them to apartheid, Bantustans, and camps, and why the Zionist militias depopulated some 500 villages in 1948. If they were Jewish, whether Palestinian or Arab or anything else, they would instead be welcomed by Israel and given a generous subsidy to take over a house whose owner was expelled because he or she is not Jewish. Describing the situation as between Israel and the Palestinians falsely frames this racial nationalism as some sort of real estate dispute, a conflict, and indeed provides Israel the rhetorical gymnastics through which it denies it is an apartheid regime. I bring this up because, in my view, nothing in the history or current reality of Israel-Palestine can be understood without this front and center. If the media were to report this core aspect accurately, the entire charade would fall apart.
Thank you, Tom. And that early part of your book is very powerful, demonstrating how many Jewish opponents there were of Zionism, and the Zionist claim that they had to, that intrinsically they could never be a part of Europe or any place other than on their own, and the racial claims that they were making, and with even Herzl calling anti-Zionist Jews, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce it correctly, Mausha, a derogatory term for religious Jews. Well, the theme that's consistent throughout your book is how the Zionist movement, as a modern nationalist ethnic movement, places the interest of constructing a Jewish state above the interests of and welfare of their fellow Jews, which Ben Gurion and Chaim Weizmann claim they speak on behalf of. There are examples of how the Zionist movement placed these nationalist interests far above the interest of fellow Jews. And some include the Jewish Agency and the Zionist movement's involvement in the Havara transfer agreement with Nazi Germany, or the Jewish Agency, how it responded to the 1938 Evian conference. Can you speak about one of those as an example of how far they put the interests of the Zionist movement above the interests of fellow Jews?
Yes, of course. Well, Hitler's rise as chancellor in January 1933 quickly led to calls for an international boycott of German goods and services. There was Zionist resistance. For example, the UK Board of Deputies of British Jews, which was a Zionist organization, opposed the idea. But revulsion over the news from Germany led to a million-strong show of support throughout the United States in March of that year. In New York alone, 55,000 people crowded in and around New York's Madison Square Garden as prominent Jewish and Christian leaders demanded the boycott of the Nazis. The boycott hit Germany hard. Within a few months, its shipping and transatlantic passenger industry was almost bankrupt. And this had been an important source of foreign capital for the Reich. Heavy machinery exports plummeted to half their 1930 levels, and the same fate befell Germany's once lucrative medical industry. Foreign investments plummeted, hurting not just the national purse, but also the unquantifiable element of academic respectability. Now, whether the boycott ultimately would have brought down the Reich, we'll never know. The reason we'll never know is because the Zionists exploited the boycott, broke it for their own benefit. In what became what you mentioned, the Havara transfer agreement, Jews with enough money to take part in the scheme were able to leave Germany with some of their money, while Germany received desperately needed capital. For the Nazis, it was also a propaganda win because they could say that the boycott breaking deal had been made by Jews. Now, the transfer agreement has been justified on the grounds that it allowed some Jews to escape Germany. But this rationale fails under scrutiny because the Jewish agency's huge profit from the deal was not put into saving less fortunate Jews. It was all put into the Zionist project. During the terrible years of the late 1930s through to the end of the Second World War, Zionist leaders fought against safe haven for Jews unless that safe haven was in Palestine. That is, unless it served Zionism. It was not simply a matter of not pursuing safe haven anywhere in safe countries, which already would have been pretty damning, but actively and even violently blocking it. You mentioned the Arian Conference in 1938. Representatives of 32 nations met in France at the request of US President Roosevelt to discuss shared responsibility for the resettlement of Jewish targets of Nazism. Now, even though Nazi intentions were long clear by that point, the failure of the conference was in large part due to the failure of the Zionist movement to support it. The Board of Deputies of British Jews viewed, quote, mass emigration to various countries as no solution to the Jewish troubles in Central Europe. And the Zionist Organization of America adopted a resolution insisting that Palestine be the conference's sole answer to the emergency. Ben-Gurion himself, who was also responsible, open safe haven for Jews, he correctly argued, would weaken the Zionist project. And not even Kristallnacht changed his priorities. Speaking in December of 1938, the month after that terrible night heralded the beginning of the Holocaust, Ben-Gurion assailed attempts to save Germany's Jewish children, unless it was to Palestine. There is that infamous quote of his to the effect of, rather than see all the German children escape safely to England, that he'd rather see half of them slaughtered at the hands of the Nazis to get the other half to be settlers in his colonial project. Now, this has been excused as just talk, but an ex-Haganah member with whom I had spoken stated that Ben-Gurion repeated and meant this, and his actions indeed speak for him. He assailed that very attempt to save Jewish children then in progress, the Kindertransport, for which Britain placed no limit and waived all visa requirements. Not even the reality of Nazi slaughter caused any soul searching on the part of the Zionists. I'd like to cite one particularly clear example from late 1942 involving the efforts of Solomon Schoenfeld during the height of the Holocaust. Schoenfeld was a British rabbi who had in fact been a primary figure in the Kindertransport. Schoenfeld worked to get the British government to arrange safe passage for Jews who were in Axis territory. His quote, "In view of the massacres and starvation of Jews and others, interestingly, in enemy and enemy-held territories, he gathered support for a motion for the UK, quote, to declare its readiness to find temporary refuge in its own territories or in territories under its control for endangered persons." Now, this was, of course, precisely what the world needed, and inertia for his project grew quickly. By early 1943, Schoenfeld had 177 British MPs ready to support the measure, in addition to archbishops, bishops, peers, and the episcopate of England and Wales. And so, with passage of the rescue effort in sight, the Board of Deputies of British Jews, as we know, a Zionist organization, assisted from the United States by Stephen Wise, president of the World Jewish Congress, a Zionist organization, intervened and sabotaged it. Now, Wise himself had just held a press conference days earlier in the US Capitol to spread the alarm that the Nazis planned the extermination of European Jews. They all knew about the death camps. But the Zionists sabotaged the rescue project because the fraud of Zionism would have been laid bare for all to see. Schoenfeld's group tried everything to save the rescue effort, but was admonished, quote, in no uncertain terms, that they, the Board of Deputies, wise the Zionist establishment, would do whatever was necessary to squash government support for the rescue.
Yes, it's a very disturbing chapter. And even the example you give of how the Jewish agency under Ben-Gurion granted visas, because they controlled the number of Jewish immigrants into Palestine in the 1930s into the 1940s, that they granted visas to Jews in America.
Yeah.
Because they were pro-Zionist.
Yes.
No, and then that visa can't be given to a Jewish person trying to leave Europe, which is just
they preferred, and this happened also during the days of the Havara transfer agreement. But when the Zionists were controlling the visas entry into Palestine, they preferred settlers from the United States and from Britain in particular, because they had money and because they were healthy and they were able to work, as opposed to the survivors of the Holocaust who were penniless and very often still had to recuperate physically from what they had endured.
Yeah.
All along, the focus was Zionism. It had nothing to do with Jewish safety and dignity.
Right. You go in your book into great detail of the Zionist terrorist attacks, starting especially in 1939, continuing up to the 1948 war, particularly by groups like Lahai, founded by Avraham Stern, and then later the Stern Gang. I'm familiar with this topic, but I've never seen it so thoroughly recorded and documented. So I commend you for doing that. I'm wondering, though, is the launching of these attacks by 1939 the turning point of the Zionist movement, transforming from an ethno-nationalist settler colonial movement to becoming an explicitly fascist group? They're no longer just extremists committed to a nationalist goal, but they're committed through terrorism to establish a purely Jewish state. And whatever you want to choose, but I thought the Jerusalem Agreement of 1940, the bombing of the ship Patria, all reflect these fascist tendencies. But I don't know how you feel about that.
Well, I think for an overview of this, I think one needs to go briefly back to World War I. In 1915, Herbert Samuel, a Zionist and a member of parliament, proposed to the cabinet that Britain help establish what he called the restoration of the Jews to Palestine, the messianic character of the movement. Now, the question, why did the Zionists need the British? Well, according to Herbert Samuel, it was because this so-called restoration faced an obstacle. What was the obstacle? As Samuel explained it, the settlers might not at first be able to, quote, command obedience from the people of the land. Britain, however, had the military power to force that Palestinian obedience on behalf of the Zionists. So Zionism's first obstacle were the Palestinians, whose resistance against their forced dispossession was ruthlessly suppressed by the British on behalf of the Zionists. So there begins the terror against the civilians. The Zionists, particularly the Irgun, began a campaign of anti-Palestinian terror in the 30s. And this was terror in the true sense of the word, in that its victims were largely random. Now, this dual formula of random terror by the Irgun and the British repressing the Palestinian resistance, it worked for the Zionists through to about 1939, with the end of the active Palestinian resistance and the outbreak of the Second World War. It is at this point that Zionism had sufficiently established itself that the British themselves were becoming more of a hindrance than an asset. And so over the next several years, through to the 1947 reckoning at the UN, the British became the immediate obstacle to be defeated. The Palestinians they take care of later, but the British were now the immediate obstacle. The Palestinians did remain an obstacle, but it was the British that stood in the way of statehood. All through this, the Zionists were preparing for the large-scale murder and expulsion of the Palestinians once the British were gone. And while the routine killing of Palestinians continued in the background, there are no good figures for this. The British kept good records for British victims and for Jewish victims, but of Palestinians, there's only the occasional comment that their random killings by the settlers continued. One favorite that comes up often, for example, was the knifing of Palestinians by the settlers on the shore at night. Now, to assist in this, the Zionists transferred the Nazi brand as needed, first onto the British and then onto the Palestinians. And this indeed is how the Zionists in 1948 got the survivors of Nazi racism now to raise village after village because of people's ethnicity. The Patria ship that you mentioned is a very good example of how the lives of the survivors of the war only served Zionism as settlers. The ship had arrived at the shore without landing permits, and the British were going to have the ship continue to Mauritius, where there were facilities for the immigrants, and they would be safe from the war. Now, the Zionists needed the immigrants, the refugees from the war, to remain in Palestine. How are they going to do that? They blew up the ship. Now, obviously, the intent was to blow up the ship with as few fatalities as possible. But something approaching 300 people, most of them survivors of the horror in Europe, were killed by the Zionists in order to get the remaining to be settlers in the state. And in the final insult against their victims, the Zionists accused the immigrants themselves of having committed the crime. They turned it around as having been a mass suicide because these survivors of the horror in Europe, who by no means were Zionists, were so dedicated to the Zionist cause that they committed suicide rather than be shipped off to Mauritius, even on a temporary basis.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, I think going back to World War I, and that they've always been committed to a Palestine free of Arabs, of Palestinians, has always been their objective. In the years before 1939, they could accomplish it with British support. After 39, they became an obstacle. I hope you purchase the book, because there's also this fascinating, you could almost have a whole webinar, Tom, on how the Zionist movement used these ships as propaganda tools. Yeah. And one that I didn't know about was the Empire Lifeguard. We don't need to go into detail about it, but they also had planted a bomb, but it went off after everyone disembarked. There were almost 259 passengers. I just want to read a quote, and it shows you how callous the Zionist movement was to fellow Jews in the project of achieving their nationalist movement, their Zionist movement. As you write, the bizarre case of the Empire Lifeguard stands out as a testament to the mentality and values of all involved, the Jewish agency, Haganah, and U.S. Zionists. Terror for its own sake without thought of consequence. The lives of 259 people, most of them Jewish survivors of the war, were gambled for a jeer devoid of purpose. It was a publicity stunt that could have ended up massacring over 200 people. Do you want to add something quickly?
Yeah, just the really important point about the Empire Lifeguard was that in this case, the passengers were legal immigrants coming in under quota. In other words, it wasn't like the Patria, where the Jewish agency had to try to blow the thing up in order to get the people to remain. No, the Empire Lifeguard, these were coming in under quota. They were going to settle there. The
Right,
blowing up of the ship was just because it was a British ship.
right. Just unbelievable. At the expense almost
Yeah.
of killing all these people.
There
I,
are figures that do quote a Jewish dead from that, but it's interesting that there's no reliable figure. Even some Zionist sources do quote, I forget the exact figure, but roughly 50 people died in the bombing. I did not state that outright because I could not find proof.
right, I remember that in a footnote. I want to ask you two more questions because we want to move on then to question and answer. So if you have any questions for Tom, please post them in the Q&A chat box. We've often heard that the Zionist movement generously accepted the partition plans that were offered before World War I, during the war, after World War II, certainly at the UN 1947. But as you have shown, they were explicit in rejecting these plans, and you refer to it as the partition scheme. And you argued that the British only supported it because they knew they couldn't contain the Zionist terrorist gangs. Can you discuss why the Americans and British promoted partition, even when they were aware that the Zionists were intent on undermining it? Or if you want to focus on why the Zionists opposed partition?
Well, the quick answer was to save their own skins. Now, as you know, 2 years after the war, the United Nations, as the story goes, offered both the Zionists and the Palestinians a state, General Assembly Resolution 181. And the result, well, we're told that Israel's founders embraced the offer with gratitude, whereas the Palestinians scoffed at it. This is a good quote in the words of the prominent Zionist watchdog Camera. As they put it, quote, "The fundamental fact is that had the Palestinians accepted partition, there would have been a Palestinian state since 1948, and there would not have been a single Palestinian refugee." This is the official line. And the logic itself is, to say the least, a bit bizarre on the face of it, but let's leave that aside. The fact is that the Zionists agreed to partition only to get a state. The idea that the Zionists actually agreed to partition is widely repeated even in serious history books, but it is fiction. Within the walls of the UN, the Jewish agency made a clever chess move. They pretended to go along with it as they frenetically prepared to defeat it, and indeed had been preparing to do so for years. And to be clear, this is not simply my interpretation of the historical record, it is their own explicit, repeatedly stated plans. They were fanatically opposed to partition and had been preparing to defeat it militarily for years. And the key point is that everyone involved at the UN knew it. They feigned acceptance of partition because it handed them statehood, which was the single weapon powerful enough to defeat partition, to seize all the land, and to cleanse it of non-Jews. Statehood was the key to everything. Chaim Weizmann expressed it like this in his meeting with Mussolini in 1934. He said that statehood is like the Archimedean fulcrum. You put the fulcrum in the right place and you can do anything. The determination that there would never be a Palestinian state, that they would take all of Palestine at a minimum, partition be damned, and that they would expel the land's non-Jews was explicit and unwavering throughout the 3 decades from the end of World War I to Israel's self-declaration of statehood and beyond. And any historical quotes you hear to the contrary are cherry-picked tidbits that were intended for public consumption. Now, the reason why we know it was a scam altogether, aside from the fact that historically it was obvious that the Zionists would not abide by it, there was one possible glitch in their plans. And that was if the British, or ultimately the United Nations, were to propose a state of all the people, whether a true single state or a binational state, instead of partition. This would make their job vastly more difficult. And indeed, when in the summer of 1947, UNSCOP, the US committee tasked with proposing a solution to the Palestine problem, when they presented their recommendation, there were two proposals: partition or a binational single state. Now, presented with both options, why was a state of all its people the loser? The obvious answer, based on history, is actually stated outright in British cabinet papers at the time. The answer is fear of Zionist terrorism. The UN selected partition because they knew that if they didn't, the Zionists would have responded with, quote, this is from the British, an intensification of Jewish terrorism, that is, an intensification of Zionist terror beyond that which had already brought Palestine to its knees and, to the point for the decision makers, was increasingly threatening Europe. There had already been at this point substantial Zionist terrorism in Europe and in the UK. Now, having selected partition in principle, the UN now had to map this partition. So how to explain that their partition gave more than half of the land to the Zionists, who, despite the massive influx of settlers, they were still a minority? It is the answer to this that lays to rest any lingering question that the UN knew that Israel would ignore partition and that the whole exercise was a charade. Again, quoting British records about the partition vote, quote, the desire for expansion might develop earlier if the Jewish state occupied a smaller area. So, in other words, the UN simply hoped to delay, not prevent, but simply delay Israel's first expansionist war by giving them so much up front. Now, the appeasement, of course, failed because Israel began its first expansionist war beyond this immediately. And note that it is implicit in this that the UN also assumed in advance that its own Security Council would do nothing to stop Israel. Throughout the year before partition, there is consistent proof that both the British and the Americans knew perfectly well that the Zionists would never respect partition. Partition, it was a scam. And above all, the Palestinians, who, by the way, the Palestinians counterproposed a constitution similar to that of the United States, they knew it was a scam.
Thank you, Tom. That's a great explanation, and it's so interesting to read in your book of how open the Zionists were in saying they intended to. They had every right to move beyond Palestine into the east of Jordan, and that their ambitions even, and they said this openly, into Lebanon and Syria.
Yeah. Yes.
Last question, and then we'll move on to questions that Philip will lead. In the penultimate chapter of your book, you explore that even after the state of Israel is created and statehood is secured, they continued the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which Palestinians refer to as the continuing Nakba. There are too many examples to go through, and you provide a good documentation of it. But can you highlight to us why it's important to remember some of the crimes that Israel committed, even after they had secured a military hold of the land? There was the killings. There was the case of Abu Ghosh, or the village of Ikrit and Kafr Birim, or Wadi Araba incident, or the Eastern Christmas Eve killings in 1952. There are too many. Is there one that stands out for you of how even after 1948 they continue this Nakba?
The Israeli attacks into the West Bank and Gaza, it was strategy. It's the whole thing. A single attack wasn't going to do it. It had to instill this fear of of the Israeli presence. The Zionist project demanded, at the bare minimum, all of historic Palestine, the entire land from river to sea. So after 1948, by definition, non-Jews that remained in the land now under Israeli control, which included more than half of the land the UN had ostensibly given to the Palestinians, would never live in peace. And the lives of the Palestinians now on the Palestinian side of the armistice line must be made into a living hell. Why? This was to accomplish either of two results. Either, one, to destroy any hope among Palestinians that they could ever regain normal lives as long as they were on land wanted by Israel, and so to make them leave, quote unquote, of their own accord, or two, to provoke them to respond to the Israeli terror with their own attacks, which Israel would then frame as unprovoked Palestinian attacks against which Israel would have to defend itself with new terror. And this is key because it, of course, remains the core day-to-day tactic today. Israel was born by the wholesale hijacking of Palestine. It wasn't just the land itself. It was uncountable Palestinian businesses, orchids, assets, factories, homes, schools, villas, hospitals, equipment, industries, and export trades, all stolen by Israel and its settlers. What we call the Israeli state was an entire intact country. The Zionists simply hung their own shingle on its door. But Israel wanted the whole thing, and it wanted it free of non-Jews. The Zionists waited for the opportunity, which came in 1967, but in the meantime, had to maintain a state of terror over the West Bank and Gaza. Again, I think it was the large picture. Anyone who tried to return to his or her legal homes was shot dead on sight or captured and tortured. Well-documented cases include one you mentioned, the forced death march into the desert along the southern Israeli-Jordanian frontier, the so-called Wadi Araba incident of June 1950. But we know there were more. The same with the terror attacks. What we have is well documented, but just a sampling. They are likely typical. There's the Yallow Village incident in which the IDF executed, and executed is the word, 2 children, a 10-year-old girl and a 12-year-old boy who were out collecting firewood. There was the Christmas Eve massacre in the Bethlehem area in January 1952, that is Eastern Christmas Eve, using the excuse of a young woman who had been murdered in Israel and for which crime there were no suspects. Now, this incident is remarkable in that it is a case in which there is proof that Israel knowingly framed innocent Palestinians. In this and other cases, Israel's political need to frame Palestinians meant that it had to let the actual murderers remain free, because the very act of looking for them would obviously expose their own lies. The best remembered massacre, and the one that caused the most political problem for Israel at the time, was that of Kibbutz in October of 1953, in which a similar pretense was used to murder 69 Palestinians, half of them women and children. 49 houses were blown up, along with the village water reservoir and the school. As today, criticism of the crime at the time was met with a smear of anti-Semitism.
Right, and I think that is it may be the example you gave where the United States asked, let us see the pretense almost of an investigation.
Yes.
And not an actual investigation, which continues today. Where Tom, thank you so much for your responses and your clarity on this issue. I'm going to pass it along to Philip, who is going to share questions from the audience. Thank you again, Tom.
Thank you.
I think we were scheduled for 1 hour, but is that right? But folks are welcome to stay longer if they wish. I see that there are still almost 100 people with us. So please hang on, and we'll. I don't know what time, Muna, Awad, you want me to kind
I think
of.
5 to 10 more minutes. Tom, is that good with you?
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and by the way, in response to some questions, yes, this will be has been recorded, and it'll be saved, and I think we can send you a link to all people who registered, including, people who did not attend but did register. We'll send you the link to the recording. And yeah, I agree. This was a really fantastic discussion, and thank you very much, Tom and Awad, and everybody else who has participated and our guests. I'll start with a question from Patricia. I'm hoping I said your name correctly. Early on, Tom, you mentioned that Zionism is a kind of psychosis, and Patricia is asking if this psychosis is due to Shoah, to the Holocaust, Shoah, and how it can be mitigated if she's a psychoanalyst or psychologist, and so she's asking from that perspective.
Well, if that's her specialty, I don't know if the mic can be handed to her, but she may have a better view of this than I do. In my view, no, this is not a result of the Shoah. In my view, it's the opposite, that the Holocaust was exploited for the purpose of Zionism. Obviously, Zionism and Zionism's fascistical hold on Jewish identity long predates the Holocaust. The historical record, in my view, makes clear that the Zionists used the Holocaust for its purposes rather than being an answer to it. I don't think it's the cause of what I call the psychosis. I think the psychosis is a tool by the Zionists to keep control.
Thank you for that.
If she has a different opinion, I'd be very interested to hear.
Is Patricia still here? And if you can, Jamila, if you can see if she's still here, yeah, please go ahead and unmute her. No, hearing that, seeing that she is not around, maybe, or has not come forth.
Yes. Yeah, I'm here. Hi.
Okay, Patricia, please.
Yes, hi, I'm here. Well, I didn't quite mean it that way. In my work as a psychotherapist, trauma is if it's not processed, it keeps repeating itself. So in this sense, at a nationwide, I don't know if it's possible. I agree with you what you said, Tom. But I was thinking that because the trauma of the Shoah has not been really processed, Zionists are repeating the trauma towards the Palestinian, making the Palestinians suffer for something that they don't have really any reason to. Do you see what I'm saying?
I'm sorry?
Yeah, do you see what I'm saying? It's a repetition because the first trauma was not processed.
Yeah, I've heard this idea before, and I don't have the expertise to say anything intelligent, but it doesn't look that way to me, because the people who were really leading the show were not victims of the Holocaust. So I don't really see that it follows, and quite the contrary, that the survivors of the Holocaust were manipulated to the Zionist ideal. It happened a few times where Ben-Gurion ordered massacres in the West Bank, and in order to cover the state's name, he blamed Holocaust survivors, using this reason that, well, they're a little bit crazy because of what they went through, therefore they're the ones that must have done it. So I really don't see that the impetus for what was happening was really a case of the victims of this playing this out against someone else. I think it's much more cynical than that.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, I just want to add something, if I may. This is not the first instance in history where people who suffered tremendous, who experienced tremendous suffering, oppressed and persecuted, turned to be oppressors. Because, as I mean, in the American experience itself, there were the religious minorities from Europe, that were really seriously oppressed in Europe. And when they came to the US, they ethnically cleansed the native people. And there are many other examples, I think, in history. There were a number of questions related to, well, what next? And actually, there was one question that included what you think of the impact of BDS, which has really had some remarkable successes, and the reports like from Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International naming Israel as an apartheid state, and whether that is really making a difference, and what you see as the future of Israel. And also appended to this question is whether Israel can survive without Zionism.
As far as BDS, yes, I think BDS is absolutely the right way to go. And the beauty of BDS is not for any economic impact it can have on the state. The beauty of BDS is that for the public, you say you're going to boycott Israel, and they ask, boycott Israel? Why are you going to boycott Israel? That's the reason for BDS, because it forces the question. As far as apartheid, obviously the reports from B'Tselem, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, these are all very welcome. And we mustn't forget that the first one was the report by Richard Falk and Virginia Tilley that was suppressed by the UN under US pressure. But the fact is that it has been an apartheid state, river to sea, since the end of the First World War. Already in 1922, Winston Churchill is bragging that the British have removed the Palestinians from any voice in the affairs of their own land on behalf of the Zionists. Now, this is apartheid, and it has remained the state of the land ever since then. This is not something new. As far as the future of the Israeli state, well, obviously the Israeli state is at its core, it's based on Zionism. Without Zionism, it doesn't exist. And I think it's important that we go straight to the crux of the Israeli state. Now, if we ask what is the Israeli state, I think most people would say, well, it's the Jewish state. Now, it's not the Jewish state in the sense of any other nation with a national religion. It's a completely different thing. This is a racial thing by its own definition. Its self-identity is based on preserving what it considers to be blood purity by way of laws forbidding marriage between someone who, according to the state, is Jewish and someone who, according to the state, is not Jewish, and that this select bloodline must remain the majority, and that all others are legally lesser human beings. Now, herein lies Israel's conundrum. Such race laws and the concept of blood purity, it should shock us, it should revolt us. But Israel has no choice, because without these race laws, Israel, by its own self-identity, a definition that we of the modern, allegedly enlightened West have embraced. And without this self-identity, it would cease to exist. So if we're going to accept this idea of such a state based on the concept of bloodline purity, we can't blame Israel for what it does. We can't blame Israel for its ethnic cleansings of 1948 and 1967. We can't blame Israel for its back burner ethnic cleansing that has been going on all along through to this moment. we can't blame Israel for keeping millions of human beings in camps because they're not of the select lineage. Either we have to accept that this is not only something that defines who we are as a people, but something that we should massively fund and defend. There is going to be a point at which we can no longer have it both ways. And I personally believe that a point is going to come when the settlers overtly take over so much of the West Bank that we can no longer live this lie that it's only an occupation, that it'll be obvious that it's an annexation. And it'll be obvious that the Palestinian Authority is simply this chimera that serves the Israeli narrative, that there is no such thing, that the entire land is one land with one government ruling over everybody. Now, once you can no longer deny that, then you have to admit it's an apartheid state. Now, we're not supposed to like apartheid. So I personally see the Israeli state as living on borrowed time. I think it's past its sell-by date. And we're simply waiting for the narrative to wear down to the point where it's no longer viable, at which point the entire thing will fall apart. I think it is time that we should not be afraid to say that the Zionist state as such must end. We're always browbeaten into this idea of the Israeli state's right to exist. No nation state has the intrinsic right to exist. People have the right to exist. Everybody there on that land, they have the right to exist. The Israeli state does not.
Well, I was told that I should try to pitch probably the last question because we have only 3 more minutes left. I'm sorry that I couldn't pitch all the other really good questions, but the last question is kind of related to this. What is our role? I'm sure you've heard this before. And how can organizations that are in solidarity with the Palestinians and seeking a just peace for Israelis and Palestinians. What can we do to here, especially, to change things? And specifically, there was a question about lobbying Congress.
Yes, that's the big question, isn't it? In my view, if I had to pick one thing where I think that we need to improve, and I think I may have touched on this just a bit before, is that we always tend to fight our battle on their terms. We always answer their allegations on their terms, on their narrative. I think we have to stop this. And it's so entrenched that we do it in ways that we're not even aware of. Just to mention one word, the word conflict. Every time we use the word conflict, we're handing the Zionists a gift. Every time, in my view, we use the word occupation, we're handing them a gift. What would happen if, which never will happen, but let's say that one day we woke up and Israel said, we're going to completely pull out of the land beyond the armistice line, end the occupation. Well, would that fix the problem? No, it wouldn't fix the problem. We have to look at the whole thing and simply keep coming back to everybody between river and sea is an equal human being. End of story. End of story. If we end the occupation, what? We'll end up with the refugees still unable to return to their own legal homes on the Israeli side of the armistice line, race laws still affecting non-Jews in what's now under Israeli control. We'd still have the Palestinians subject to the Palestinian Authority. This would not fix the problem. Every time we approach any aspect of this, we need to stop and think, how do we step back and approach this from our standpoint, not from their standpoint? And a major one is, of course, what happens anytime anybody just blurts out the truth is we're silenced with the smear of anti-Semitism. This is another major issue. our typical response over and over again is what? It's to defend ourselves. We say, no, I'm not anti-Semitic. No, this is a blunder. This is on their terms. It has to be turned around. When you are falsely accused of anti-Semitism in order to silence you, the response has to be the opposite. Say what? I'm fighting for human rights. Are you suggesting that Jews are opposed to this? It always has to be turned around and put on them, because they are, in fact, the anti-Semites.
Thank you very much, Tom. This is really amazing. In fact, has given me some practical ideas, which I'm going to pitch to the groups that I work with, about, strategy. It really speaks to our choice of solidarity work. So that's really very valuable. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Loving and merciful God, we thank you for our speaker, Tom, and his wealth of knowledge. Thank you for his courage to tell the truth. May we use what we learned from this webinar to speed up the liberation of Palestine. And now the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon us, be gracious unto us. The Lord lift up his countenance upon us and give us peace this day and forever. Amen.